Hi, my name is Jessica Diehl, and I'm an assistant professor in the Master of Landscape Architecture program at the National University of Singapore. And my co-author is my PhD student, Ching. The title of this presentation is Interrogating the Geographic Boundaries of Urban Agriculture, an investigation of farming in Singapore and Sydney. With growing urban populations' rising demand for food, coupled with the inherent risks of relying on the global food system, many city governments are developing planning strategies for implementing urban agriculture at different scales. And so while we typically think of urban agriculture as food that's produced within the boundaries of the city, really the most important distinguishing characteristic is that not so much this location in the city, but really the fact that it is an integral part of the urban economic, social, and ecological system. So this presentation today, which is part of a larger project, is really about interrogating urban agricultural practice as embedded in that urban system, looking at two high-earning global cities, that of Singapore and Sydney. And the findings from this research are starting to highlight some characteristics that seem critical and consequential in the relationship between agriculture and the city, and thereby redefining some farms as urban, although located outside the city, maybe peri-urban or even rural fringe, and some as rural, even though they're technically located inside the city. In this research, we look specifically at commercial urban farming. So to conceptualize urban farming as embedded in these urban systems, it suggests that sustainable practice isn't just about connecting farms to consumers through these short supply chains, but also connecting farms to all aspects of the urban food system. And broadly speaking, the urban food system is comprised of different modes of provisioning within a geographic footprint, dependent on resources, and being impacting by other urban conditions. Beginning with the context of Sydney, which has a population of just under 5 million and is about the same size as Singapore, the map here shows a spatial pattern of urban, peri-urban, and rural farming that's surrounding the city of Sydney, and so that's represented in the pink. This research focused specifically on farms selling directly to the local Sydney markets, farmers markets, local wholesale distributors, etc. So while there are an estimated 2,000 vegetable growers in that larger Sydney basin, the target population for this research was really a small fraction of those growers, who are majority more oriented towards the export market. Moving over to the context of Singapore, which is an island city-state and has been classified as 100% urban for more than 50 years. The country is largely urbanized with quite a high density settlement, and currently less than 1% of the land is allocated for agriculture. And so you can see in this map kind of a splattering of urban agriculture across the island, the majority of that being community gardens, and then the urban farms, the commercial urban farms, are concentrated up in the northwest corner. Research aims were to describe farm practices, summarize benefits and barriers, to map social and spatial egocentric social networks with the farmer as the ego, and to identify livelihood alternatives. This was done through semi-structured qualitative interviews with farmers producing or selling in the urban context. So in Sydney, we used a farmers market list as the sampling frame to ensure that farmers were selling specifically to urban customers. And then in Singapore, it was a random sample of land-based farms. So data were documented additionally through field observation, memoing, and photography, and analysis was a deductive and inductive process. So here's an overview of the interview guide, and I don't really have time to go into all the nuances that went into developing the semi-structured interviews, but suffice it to say, so there are 4 components, and the key piece being understanding social networks as a way to understand how the farmers were embedded in that larger urban food system. So using the Sustainable Livelihoods framework as a way of defining farmers as accessing resources across this different urban food system spectrum, interacting with different actors across the food system as a way to make their livelihood sustainable. And so this kind of gives you a snapshot of how the data collection or how the interviews were conducted. So moving on quickly to findings, beginning with farm practices, I first want to make a note about the small sample size. So let me highlight that these were in-depth interviews and the study was designed as an exploratory study. And secondly, the sampling frame in both cases was traditional farms in or near the city selling directly to urban customers, which in both cases reduced the total sample population to less than about 100 farmers. So specifically in Sydney and Singapore, the majority of farms, of course, were traditional farms, but they primarily grew vegetables with a few other diverse products. About half were organic and about half applied conventional practices. Main difference was that in Sydney, interviewees were diverse in age, education, citizenship, family history, product, and scale of operation, whereas in Singapore, interviewees were diverse in age, but were quite similar in terms of university educated, Singaporean-born, family history of farming, growing mostly vegetables on 2 to 3 hectare farms. In Sydney, many farmers were second or third generation immigrants, versus Singapore, they were Singaporeans, but the majority of farm labor was immigrant workers. And then finally, in addition to commercial orientation, all farms, or many farms in both cases, provided multifunctional services, ranging from cooking classes to farm tours. In terms of benefits, Sydney and Singapore were quite similar in that the majority of farmers really said that they chose this profession because of the lifestyle, the flexible hours, being able to work with family, being able to work on the land and be exposed to clean air, clean food, have control over the food that they were eating. In terms of barriers, there was some similarity in that lack of ownership really put a lot of pressure on farmers in Singapore, whereas in Sydney, even though many of the farmers owned the land, there was a lot of pressure from development. So in both cases, whether they owned the land or were leasing the land, development pressure was really, really a big threat to the sustainability and future viability of their farms. Measuring social networks was the primary focus of this research, but since the analysis is ongoing, I will just show you some of the cognitive maps that have been created after coding the interviews in Atlas TI, and that will be used as a precursor for spatial mapping. So you can see the key in the top right of this slide, and you see that the farm as the ego or center of the network that is then surrounded by the different agents representing different components of the urban system. These are all the people that the farmers interact with and to gain access to and influence different resources to sustain their farm. And here you can see 4 examples from each city. They show all of the interactions and all of the nuances in the ways that farmers interact with and engage with those key actors. This begins to illustrate how farms are embedded or disconnected from the local urban food system. Okay, so because the analysis is ongoing, I unfortunately don't have any maps to share with you to show spatial patterns. But what I've started to do is to summarize different social networks to give you a sense of the embeddedness in the urban system. So let me first say that there were some rural Sydney farms included in the sample, but I did find that they were linked to the urban system in all other aspects. Secondly, I'd like to highlight that in both Sydney and Singapore, farmers had to rely on foreign labor for daily farm operation. This was largely due to the lack of knowledge and skills to farm among urban residents, as well as the high cost of employing Sydney and Singapore citizens. So as an aside, the rural farms in Sydney primarily hired local labor as opposed to the majority of urban and peri-urban farms who employed overseas workers. So finally, on the market and consumption side, it's important to highlight that there were farms in both cities that were located in the urban context, but exporting some or even all of their product overseas or to foreign customers. So to summarize the pattern that's emerging in city in terms of those social networks across the urban food system, three patterns emerged. There were farmers that were located in the urban context, but seemed to be embedded and were embedded in the urban system. So they have local labor, they're selling to local markets. Conversely, there were farms located in the urban context that were embedded in both the local and the global system. So they had imported labor and they were exporting their product. And then the third pattern were farms that were located outside the urban boundary, even beyond the peri-urban fringe, but embedded in the urban system. Everything that they were producing was going to that city system. In Singapore, two patterns seem to be emerging. The first are urban farms that are embedded in both the local and global system. All the farmers we spoke with were importing labor, and many of them were exporting at least some part of their product to overseas distributors. The second pattern was that traditional in-soil farms that are at the end of their land lease will plan to relocate overseas, but still sell back to the Singapore market. This is interesting because the Singapore government owns most of the land, and they're not renewing leases for farms that are unwilling or unable to adopt high-tech practices, which is what the current policies and incentives are funding. And then the fourth aim was to look at livelihood alternatives. So it asked farmers, what would you do if you couldn't farm? So in Sydney, a majority of farmers are at retirement age. So that was, of course, their response to that. There was also a mention that there are limited options for farmers with low education. So they weren't sure what they would do. And then others, because of their high education, said that they would move into some other type of educated profession. Whereas in Singapore, what was interesting is that many of the farmers said that they would either move into processing and distribution, in which case they would become importers of food, so still linked to the local food system, but importing food from overseas. And then on the other end of the spectrum were those that said that they were planning to expatriate and farm in another country, but still import to Singapore. And then there were a range of other responses. In this brief presentation, I've just given a high-level overview of this research project. And really, so the motivation for this project was an investigation of urban farming as a livelihood pursuit, and really trying to understand how farmers access resources through their social networks to make it a sustainable endeavor. But what has emerged, and what I think is really interesting, is this question of what it means to be an urban farmer. And can a farm be considered urban if it is not embedded in the urban system, but is withdrawing resources from outside the city and or sending resources out of the city? And on the other side are farmers that are not located in the urban context, but are embedded in it and reliant on it. Are they not considered urban farmers? So while diverse patterns emerged, you can start to see that it's not just about the location, but really about accessing resources from local to overseas, and allowing for a more nuanced understanding of how we conceptualize urban agriculture. So what I found is that farmers were accessing resources in a variety of different ways in an effort to sustain their agrarian livelihoods. And so these different ways give us clues as to how the urban system is going to impact them in the future. So finally, in conclusion, very simply, the urban food system is dynamic and complex, and there are multiple and often competing actors and processes driving it. With increasing pressures on peri-urban agriculture land for affordable housing, and increased competition from cheap imported food, local food producers really are trying to leverage their social networks and resources across the food system. So this study, I hope, has illustrated the drivers and constraints for sustaining and implementing different types of urban agriculture for more resilient urban food systems. So in addition to simply providing land for agricultural use, city governments and planners could focus on programs to support local farm labor worker programs, because that seems to be one of the biggest overseas requirements, as well as providing easier access to local markets, because in some cases farmers were forced to export their products overseas, and then education and outreach about the benefits of locally grown food to sort of bolster that local consumer base. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge the Singapore Ministry of Education who funded this research. Thank you. Please feel free to email me or visit my blog.